In a world where headlines scream about celebrity scandals and political drama, there exists a quiet army of unsung heroes working in the shadows of society. They wake before dawn, stay past midnight, and sacrifice their own comfort for complete strangers. They are the carers, the men and women who hold trembling hands, wipe away tears, and become the voice of hope when darkness feels overwhelming. For too long, their extraordinary dedication has gone unnoticed by those in power. But on a crisp autumn morning at Windsor Castle, history was about to change. The most famous residence in Britain was preparing to open its ancient doors, not for dignitaries or celebrities, but for the very people who keep our most vulnerable citizens alive with dignity and love. This is the remarkable true story of how King Charles III and Queen Camilla chose to shine the brightest spotlight in the kingdom on the everyday heroes who transform lives one gentle act at a time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood at the window of his private study, a steaming cup of tea forgotten on the mahogany desk behind him. The 75-year-old monarch had been awake since 5:30, not unusual for a man whose entire life had been governed by duty and service. But this particular morning carried a weight different from the usual ceremonial obligations and state affairs that filled his calendar. 3 weeks earlier, during a routine visit to a care facility in Manchester, the king had witnessed something that would fundamentally shift his perspective on honor and recognition. Margaret Thompson, a 58-year-old carer with gentle eyes and hands weathered by decades of service, had been helping an elderly gentleman with dementia eat his breakfast. The patience she demonstrated, the way she spoke to him with genuine warmth despite his confusion, and the dignity she preserved for a man who could no longer remember his own name, struck Charles with profound force. The king had watched from the doorway, unnoticed by Margaret, as she spent nearly an hour ensuring her patient not only ate, but felt valued and respected throughout the process. She had hummed a soft melody while carefully spooning soup, paused to listen when the man spoke incoherently, and responded as if his words carried great meaning. When the meal was finished, she had gently cleaned his face and straightened his shirt, treating him not as a burden or a task to be completed, but as a human being deserving of love and respect. That evening, Charles had returned to Windsor Castle, deeply troubled by a realization that had been building for months. The highest honors in the land, the orders of the British Empire, the knighthoods and damehoods, consistently went to celebrities, business leaders, and politicians. Yet people like Margaret Thompson, who performed daily miracles of compassion, remained invisible to the formal recognition system. The more he reflected on this disparity, the more convinced he became that something needed to change. Queen Camilla had noticed her husband's preoccupation immediately. After 40 years together, first as friends, then as controversial lovers, and finally as devoted spouses, she could read his moods like a familiar book. Over dinner that night, as Charles pushed his food around his plate while lost in thought, she had gently probed until the story of Margaret Thompson emerged. "We must do something," Charles had said, his voice carrying the conviction that had driven him through decades of advocacy for environmental causes and traditional crafts. These people dedicate their lives to caring for our most vulnerable citizens, often for wages that barely allow them to support their own families. They receive no public recognition, no ceremonies, no acknowledgement of their extraordinary contribution to society. Camilla had nodded thoughtfully. Her own experiences with domestic abuse charities and literacy programs had shown her the vast network of individuals who work tirelessly behind the scenes to support those in need. "What do you have in mind?" she had asked. Though she suspected she already knew her husband well enough to predict his answer. "We invite them here," Charles had said simply, "to Windsor Castle. Not for a quick photo opportunity or a perfunctory handshake, but for a proper celebration. We show them the respect and honor they deserve." The idea had seemed simple enough that evening, but as Charles now gazed out at the castle grounds, he understood the complexity of what they were attempting to orchestrate. This would not be a typical royal engagement with carefully scripted interactions and predetermined outcomes. They were planning to welcome into their home people who had never experienced anything remotely like royal protocol, who might feel intimidated or overwhelmed by the grandeur of their surroundings. Private Secretary Sir Clive Alderton had initially expressed concerns about the logistics and security implications. "Your Majesty," he had said during their first planning meeting, "while I certainly understand the noble intentions, hosting such an event presents numerous challenges. These individuals have no experience with royal protocol, which could lead to awkward situations. Additionally, the security screening for such a large group of people from diverse backgrounds would be extensive." Charles had listened patiently to these objections, understanding that his staff's primary concern was protecting both the monarchy's dignity and his personal safety. But his resolve had only strengthened with each practical concern raised. "Sir Clive," he had replied with quiet firmness, "the monarchy's dignity is not threatened by honouring those who serve others. If anything, it is enhanced. As for security concerns, I trust our excellent security team to adapt their procedures accordingly." The planning process had taken on a life of its own, as word of the King's intentions spread through the relevant government departments and charitable organisations. Nominations began flowing in from across the United Kingdom, each one telling a story of someone who had gone far beyond their professional obligations to care for others. There was Thomas Chen, a 34-year-old nurse who had worked triple shifts during the pandemic and then spent his days off delivering groceries to elderly patients who couldn't leave their homes. Sarah Williams, a 29-year-old support worker who had learned sign language in her spare time to better communicate with a deaf client, then taught it to the client's entire family. David Rodriguez, a 67-year-old care home manager who had mortgaged his own house to keep his facility running when funding was cut, ensuring that the 43 residents under his care wouldn't be displaced. Each nomination file that crossed the King's desk reinforced his conviction that this event needed to happen. These were not stories of people seeking recognition or reward. They were accounts of individuals who had made profound sacrifices and shown extraordinary dedication simply because they believed it was the right thing to do. Many had never even told their own families about their additional efforts, considering them just part of their job. Queen Camilla had thrown herself into the planning with characteristic energy and attention to detail. She had insisted that the invitations be personally written rather than mass-produced, that the menu reflect comfort foods rather than elaborate cuisine, and that the dress code explicitly state that guests should wear whatever made them feel comfortable and confident. "These people spend their days making others feel welcome and valued," she had told the event planning team. "The very least we can do is ensure they feel the same way when they visit us." The Queen had also made a controversial decision that raised eyebrows among some of the castle staff. Rather than confining the event to the formal staterooms, she wanted the carers to see parts of Windsor Castle that were normally off-limits to visitors. "They should understand that this is not a tourist attraction for them," she had explained. "This is their day, and they should feel welcomed into our home, not kept at a ceremonial distance." As the date approached, both Charles and Camilla had spent considerable time researching each invited guest. The King had read every nomination letter twice, made notes about individual stories that particularly moved him, and prepared personal questions that would demonstrate his genuine interest in their work. This level of preparation was not unusual for royal engagements, but the personal investment he felt in this particular event far exceeded anything in his previous experience. The challenge they faced was unprecedented in modern royal history. Traditional royal entertaining involved people who were already familiar with the protocols and expectations of such events. Politicians, diplomats, and business leaders came equipped with experience navigating formal social situations. But the carers being invited to Windsor Castle represented a different world entirely. Many had never attended any formal event more elaborate than a staff Christmas party. Some had never even seen the inside of a restaurant fancier than their local pub. This reality had prompted extensive discussions about how to structure the day to ensure everyone felt comfortable and included. Rather than a single large reception, they had decided on smaller group activities that would allow for more intimate conversations. The King and Queen would rotate between groups, spending meaningful time with each guest rather than rushing through obligatory handshakes and posed photographs. The media attention surrounding the announced event had been overwhelmingly positive, but Charles remained focused on the guests themselves rather than public opinion. Letters had begun arriving at the castle from care workers across the country, many expressing disbelief that their profession was finally receiving recognition at the highest level. Several had included photographs of clients they had supported over the years, sharing stories of small victories and profound connections that had sustained them through difficult periods. One letter had particularly moved both the King and Queen. It came from the daughter of a man with Alzheimer's disease who had been cared for by one of the invited guests. She wrote about watching her father's dignity being preserved even as his memory failed, about a carer who had continued to treat him as a whole person rather than a collection of symptoms. "Your Majesty," the letter had concluded, "you may never understand what it means to families like ours to see our heroes finally being honored. Thank you for seeing what so many have overlooked." As the morning of the event dawned, Charles felt a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that reminded him of his childhood before important school performances. This was not merely another royal duty to be completed efficiently and gracefully. It represented a statement about what his reign would value and celebrate. In choosing to honor carers, he was declaring that service to the most vulnerable members of society deserved the highest recognition the crown could provide. The final preparations were being completed throughout the castle as Charles finished his morning tea and prepared to greet the first guests. Flowers had been arranged in every room they would visit, not with the formal grandeur typical of state occasions, but with the warm abundance Camilla preferred for intimate gatherings. The kitchen staff had prepared a menu that emphasized familiar comfort foods, alongside some special touches that would make the meal memorable without being intimidating. In a few hours, Windsor Castle would welcome 47 carers from across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. They would represent thousands of their colleagues who performed similar work with equal dedication but could not all be accommodated in a single event. Each guest carried with them stories of lives touched, dignity preserved, and hope sustained through the most challenging circumstances imaginable. As Charles walked through the castle corridors, greeting staff members who had worked tirelessly to prepare for this day, he felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. For the first time in his long public life, he was about to host an event that perfectly aligned his personal values with his royal role. The carers coming to Windsor Castle deserved this recognition, not because it would generate positive publicity for the monarchy, but because their work represented the very best of human compassion and dedication. The king paused at the main entrance, where Camilla was reviewing last-minute details with the event's coordinator. She looked up and smiled, understanding immediately what he was feeling. "Ready?" she asked quietly. Charles nodded, straightening his tie and preparing to welcome the heroes who had too long remained invisible to the recognition they so richly deserved. The first coach arrived at the castle gates at precisely 11:30, carrying 12 carers from the northern regions of England and Scotland. As the vehicle passed through the ancient stone archway that had witnessed centuries of royal history, the passengers inside fell into an awed silence that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with the overwhelming reality of where they were going. Margaret Thompson sat in the third row, her hands folded carefully in her lap, wearing the navy blue dress she had purchased specifically for this occasion. At 58, she had worked in care homes for 31 years, through changes in governments, healthcare policies, and social attitudes toward aging. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined that her daily routine of feeding, washing, and comforting elderly residents would lead to an invitation to have lunch with the King and Queen of England. Beside her sat James Morrison, a 41-year-old care worker from Glasgow, whose nomination had come from the family of a young man with cerebral palsy. For 8 years, James had not only provided the required physical care, but had also learned to operate specialized communication equipment, advocated for his clients' inclusion in community activities, and eventually became such a trusted friend that he was invited to the young man's wedding as an honored guest. James had been so convinced the invitation to Windsor Castle was a prank that he had called the palace twice to verify its authenticity. The coach curved around the familiar approach to the castle, and gasps escaped from several passengers as the full majesty of the royal residence came into view. The massive medieval walls, the iconic round tower, and the precisely maintained gardens created a vista that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Several guests fumbled for their mobile phones, wanting to capture this moment before they entered a world where photography might not be appropriate. Queen Camilla stood in the castle's courtyard, having chosen to greet the guests personally rather than wait inside according to traditional protocol. She wore a warm burgundy coat that managed to be both elegant and approachable, and her smile was genuine as she watched the first group of carers emerge from their coach with a mixture of excitement and nervous uncertainty. "Welcome to Windsor Castle," she called out as the guests gathered in a somewhat uncertain cluster near the coach. "I know this might feel overwhelming, but please remember that you are here because of your extraordinary dedication to caring for others. Today is about celebrating you." The Queen's warm, conversational tone immediately began to dissolve some of the tension visible in the group. She moved among the guests, introducing herself individually and asking each person about their journey to the castle. Her genuine interest in their comfort and her ability to put people at ease were skills developed through decades of public engagements, but this felt different even to her. These conversations were not constrained by the usual time pressures and formal expectations of royal meetings. When Margaret Thompson introduced herself, mentioning that she worked at the Manchester care facility the king had recently visited, Camilla's face lit up with recognition. "His Majesty has spoken about you several times," she said. "He was deeply moved by witnessing your care for your residents. He said watching you work reminded him why this recognition was so important." Margaret felt tears threatening to overwhelm her composure. The idea that the King of England had not only noticed her work, but had been moved enough by it to remember and discuss it seemed impossible to process. "I was just doing my job, Your Majesty," she managed to say. "No," Camilla replied gently but firmly. "You were doing much more than that. And today we want to make sure you understand how much it matters." As the second and third coaches arrived, the courtyard filled with a diverse group of men and women ranging in age from early 20s to late 60s. They represented every corner of the United Kingdom and every aspect of the caring profession. There were hospital nurses and home care assistants, residential care workers and learning disability support staff, mental health advocates and dementia specialists. What united them was not their specific roles but the extraordinary dedication each had shown to improving the lives of the people in their care. King Charles emerged from the castle's main entrance as the final group was being welcomed by his wife. He moved immediately toward the gathered carers, his approach deliberately informal, and his expression one of genuine pleasure at seeing them all assembled. The guests who had been chatting quietly among themselves fell silent as the sovereign approached, but Charles quickly worked to restore the comfortable atmosphere Camilla had established. Please, don't stop talking on my account," he said with a laugh. "I've been looking forward to meeting all of you for weeks, and I want to hear about the work you do, not listen to awkward royal small talk." His comment drew nervous laughter from the group, and the ice began to break as he moved among them with the same natural warmth Camilla had demonstrated. To each person he spoke with, Charles offered specific comments that made it clear he had read their nomination materials carefully and understood their particular contributions to their profession. When he reached David Rodriguez, the care home manager who had mortgaged his house to keep his facility running, the king's expression grew more serious. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said, "I've read about the sacrifices you made to protect your residents when funding was threatened. That level of commitment to people who depend on you is exactly the kind of leadership this country needs more of." David, a man who had managed care facilities for over 20 years and thought himself beyond being impressed by authority figures, found himself genuinely moved by the king's words.
"Your Majesty, those people were my responsibility."
"I couldn't let them be displaced because of bureaucratic failures." "Exactly," Charles replied. "That's what real leadership looks like. Taking responsibility and making personal sacrifices for those who depend on you. It's something we could all learn from." These individual conversations continued for nearly an hour as both the king and queen moved through the assembled group, ensuring that every guest felt personally welcomed and recognized. The royal couple's staff, experienced in managing large-scale events, had initially worried about the informal nature of this gathering and the unpredictable responses of guests who had no experience with royal protocol, but it quickly became apparent that the lack of rigid structure was exactly what made the event so successful. The carers began to relax and engage more naturally, sharing stories about their work and asking questions about the castle and the royal family's daily life. The king, whose lifelong interest in traditional crafts and sustainable living resonated with many of the guests' practical approaches to problem-solving, found himself drawn into detailed discussions about everything from therapeutic gardening programs to innovative ways of making institutional food more appealing to elderly residents. Sarah Williams, the support worker who had learned sign language to better communicate with a deaf client, found herself in conversation with Queen Camilla about literacy programs for people with learning disabilities. Sarah's work had evolved beyond her original job description to include advocacy, family support, and community education about disability rights. Her natural passion for her clients' independence and dignity aligned perfectly with the Queen's own charitable interests. "I understand you learned an entirely new language to help one of your clients," Camilla said. "That seems like an extraordinary commitment." Sarah smiled, her initial nervousness completely forgotten in the pleasure of discussing her work with someone who clearly understood its importance. "It started because I was frustrated that I couldn't communicate properly with Danny. He's incredibly bright and funny, but nobody in his family had ever learned to sign. I realized that if I could bridge that gap, it would change everything for him." "And did it?" the Queen asked. "Completely. Once Danny could communicate easily with me, I was able to help his family understand that he needed more independence, not more protection. Now he lives in his own flat, has a job he loves, and his relationship with his parents has improved dramatically because they can finally have real conversations." The Queen nodded approvingly. "You didn't just learn a new skill, you transformed an entire family's dynamic." "That's remarkable." These types of conversations were happening throughout the courtyard, as the royal couple discovered again and again how their guests had gone far beyond their job descriptions to advocate for their clients, solve complex problems, and create meaningful improvements in people's lives. The king found himself particularly drawn to discussions about the emotional challenges of caring for people with dementia, as several guests described innovative approaches they had developed for maintaining dignity and connection, even as cognitive abilities declined. Thomas Chen, the nurse who had worked triple shifts during the pandemic, shared his experiences of providing care during the most challenging period in modern healthcare history. Your Majesty, I think what surprised me most was how much the small personal touches mattered during that time. When families couldn't visit, we became the only human connection many patients had. Holding someone's hand or just listening to them talk about their grandchildren became as important as administering medication. The king's expression grew thoughtful as he listened to Thomas describe the emotional toll of caring for critically ill patients during a time when normal support systems had collapsed. "How did you maintain hope during such a difficult period?" he asked.
"Honestly, sir, it was the other patients who kept me going. I'd see someone recover and go home to their family, and it reminded me why the work mattered.
Even when we lost people, knowing that they hadn't died alone made it feel worthwhile." As the outdoor reception continued, Castle staff members who had worked numerous high-profile events found themselves genuinely moved by what they were witnessing. The usual carefully choreographed interactions between the royal family and their guests had been replaced by authentic conversations that seemed to energize both the king and queen. Their obvious pleasure in meeting these particular guests was infectious, creating an atmosphere of celebration that felt more like a family gathering than a formal state occasion. The transformation in the carers themselves was equally remarkable to observe. People who had arrived uncertain about protocol and intimidated by their surroundings were now engaged in animated discussions about their work, clearly feeling valued and respected by the most important people in the country. Several had produced photographs of their clients, sharing personal stories that illustrated the impact of their daily efforts. When the time came to move inside for lunch, the group had bonded not only with their royal hosts, but with each other. Conversations were continuing across regional and professional boundaries as care workers from different specialties discovered common challenges and shared solutions. The networking effect had been unintended but was proving to be one of the most valuable aspects of the gathering. As they moved toward the castle's entrance, James Morrison from Glasgow found himself walking beside Margaret Thompson. "Can you believe this is actually happening?" he asked quietly. Margaret shook her head, still somewhat overwhelmed by the entire experience. 3 hours ago, I was worried about whether my dress was appropriate for meeting royalty. Now I feel like I'm visiting friends who happen to live in a castle." "That's exactly what this is," came a voice behind them. Queen Camilla had overheard their exchange and moved closer to join their conversation. "You are visiting friends. Friends who want to honor the extraordinary work you do and make sure you understand how much it means to the people whose lives you touch every day." As the group entered Windsor Castle, passing beneath centuries-old stone arches and walking across floors that had been trodden by monarchs and world leaders throughout history, they carried with them a sense of belonging that transcended the grandeur of their surroundings. They were no longer overwhelmed visitors being granted access to an exclusive world. They were honored guests whose own daily work had earned them a place in this historic setting. The state dining room at Windsor Castle had been transformed from its usual formal grandeur into something that felt both magnificent and welcoming. The long mahogany table, which had hosted world leaders and foreign dignitaries, had been set with care to accommodate 47 guests, whose greatest diplomatic achievement was often convincing an elderly person to take their medication or helping a disabled adult gain confidence in social situations. Queen Camilla had personally overseen the dining arrangements, insisting that the seating be organized to encourage conversation rather than maintain hierarchical protocol. Care workers were seated next to each other, based on common interests and experiences rather than their rank or region of origin. The king and queen would move between tables during the meal, spending time with each group rather than remaining in fixed positions at the head table. The menu had been carefully chosen to balance the special nature of the occasion with the comfort level of guests who might be intimidated by elaborate cuisine. The first course was a warming butternut squash soup that filled the room with inviting aromas, followed by a choice of roasted chicken with herbs from the castle's gardens, or fresh salmon with vegetables that many guests recognized from their own family meals. For dessert, they would enjoy individual chocolate tarts that managed to be both elegant and familiar. As the guests took their seats, many paused to absorb the reality of their surroundings. The room's rich red walls were lined with portraits of previous monarchs, and the afternoon sun streaming through tall windows created patterns of light across the polished table. Crystal glasses caught the light, and silver serving pieces gleamed against white linens. It was a setting that most had seen only in television documentaries or tourist guidebooks,
Margaret Thompson found herself seated beside a young man named Alex Patterson, a 26-year-old support worker from Northern Ireland who specialised in helping teenagers with autism transition to independent living. As they introduced themselves, Margaret was struck by Alex's passion for his work and his innovative approaches to challenges that had existed in the care sector for decades.
The biggest problem we face, Alex explained as the first course was served, is that people assume teenagers with autism can't learn independent skills. But with the right support and enough patience, most of them can achieve far more than anyone expects.
I've had clients go from being completely dependent on their families to living in their own apartments and holding down jobs.
Her own work with elderly residents had taught her similar lessons about the dangers of limiting expectations based on diagnoses or age.
It's about seeing the person rather than the condition, isn't it? She said.
Too many people in our field forget that everyone deserves dignity and the chance to reach their potential. Their conversation was interrupted by King Charles, who had approached their table to check on the progress of the meal and engage with the guests.
He listened carefully as Alex described his work with autistic teenagers, asking thoughtful questions about the specific challenges and successes he had experienced.
Mr. Ping said,
Patterson, the king said, your approach reminds me of something my late mother often said about treating every person as an individual with unique capabilities, rather than as a problem to be managed. It sounds like you've discovered that principle in your own work.
Alex felt a flush of pride at having his professional philosophy compared favourably to Queen Elizabeth's approach to public service. Your Majesty, I think the key is really listening to what each person wants from their life and then figuring out how to help them achieve it safely.
Too often we decide what's best for someone without actually asking them what would make them happy. The king's expression showed genuine interest as he considered this perspective.
That's quite profound, actually. It suggests that effective caring requires not just compassion but also respect for individual autonomy.
How do you balance protecting people with giving them independence? This question sparked a discussion that drew in other guests at nearby tables, as care workers shared their experiences of navigating the complex balance between safety and freedom that defined much of their daily work. The king listened intently, occasionally asking follow-up questions that demonstrated his growing understanding of the nuanced decisions care professionals made constantly. At another table, Queen Camilla was deep in conversation with Sarah Williams and two other support workers about the broader social challenges facing people with disabilities.
Sarah was describing her efforts to help businesses in her community become more inclusive employers, often serving as an unpaid consultant to companies wanting to hire people with learning disabilities.
The frustrating thing, Sarah explained, is that employers often assume accommodation will be expensive or complicated when usually it just requires small adjustments and clear communication.
I've seen people with Down syndrome become incredibly reliable employees because they take such pride in their work, but they need managers who understand their communication style. Camilla leaned forward, clearly engaged by the discussion. It sounds like you're not just supporting your individual clients, but working to change entire community attitudes. That must be exhausting, but also incredibly rewarding. It is both, Sarah agreed. But when I see someone like Danny, my deaf client, get promoted at his job because his employer finally understands his capabilities, it makes all the extra effort worthwhile. These small victories ripple outward and make things easier for the next person. The Queen nodded thoughtfully. You're describing systemic change happening one person, one employer, one family at a time. That's exactly how lasting social progress occurs. As the main course was served, conversations throughout the dining room had evolved into a rich exchange of experiences, challenges, and innovations. Care workers who had felt isolated in their daily work discovered they were part of a much larger community of people facing similar challenges and developing creative solutions. Many exchanged contact information, planning to share resources and support each other's efforts. David Rodriguez, the care home manager who had mortgaged his house to keep his facility operating, found himself at the center of a discussion about the financial pressures facing care providers. His decision to sacrifice his personal financial security to protect his residents had resonated deeply with other guests who had made similar choices on smaller scales. The hardest part, David explained to the group around him, wasn't the financial risk. It was knowing that if I failed, 43 elderly people would be displaced from the only home they had left. Some of them had been living in our facility for over a decade. They weren't just residents, they were family. Thomas Chen, the nurse who had worked triple shifts during the pandemic, responded immediately to David's story. That's exactly how I felt during COVID, he said. The patients became more than patients when their families couldn't visit. We became their entire support system, and failing them wasn't an option even when we were exhausted and scared. These exchanges were revealing a common thread among all the honored guests.
They had consistently prioritized the well-being of the people in their care over their own comfort, convenience, or even financial security. Their dedication went far beyond professional obligation and into the realm of personal calling. King Charles, who had been moving between tables throughout the meal, paused to address the entire room as dessert was being served. The conversations gradually quieted as guests turned their attention to their host. "I want to thank you all," he began, "not just for joining us today, but for the extraordinary work you do every day. This afternoon, I've had the privilege of listening to stories that demonstrate the very best of human compassion and dedication. You represent thousands of care professionals across our country who make profound differences in individual lives, often with no recognition or fanfare."
He paused, looking around the room at faces that showed a mixture of pride, surprise, and emotional overwhelm.
"What has impressed me most about meeting each of you is not just your professional skills, though those are clearly exceptional. It's your recognition that the people you care for are whole human beings, deserving of dignity, respect, and the opportunity to live meaningful lives. That understanding transforms care from a job into a calling." The king's words were met with appreciative murmurs and several guests wiping away tears. For many, this was the first time their work had been described in such elevated terms by someone in authority. "The British honours system exists to recognise exceptional service to our country," Charles continued. "Too often those honours have gone to people whose contributions, while valuable, are far removed from the daily struggles and needs of our most vulnerable citizens. You work directly with people in crisis, people who are aging, people with disabilities, people who cannot advocate for themselves. Your service is immediate, personal, and absolutely essential to a compassionate society." Queen Camilla rose from her seat to join her husband as he spoke. "We wanted to welcome you to our home," she added, "because we believe your work represents the values we want our country to embody. Caring for others, especially those who cannot care for themselves, is perhaps the most important work any society can prioritize." The emotional impact of these words was visible throughout the room. Several guests were openly crying, overwhelmed by having their daily efforts acknowledged at the highest level of British society. For people accustomed to working in understaffed facilities with limited resources and little public recognition, being honoured in Windsor Castle by the King and Queen felt almost surreal. As the formal meal concluded, the royal couple announced that they wanted to show their guests parts of the castle that were normally private, including the Queen's sitting room and some of the personal spaces where the family relaxed away from public duties. This invitation represented an unprecedented level of hospitality that further emphasized how much this gathering meant to their hosts. Walking through rooms filled with priceless art and historic artifacts, the care workers marveled not just at the beauty of their surroundings, but at the trust being shown to them. They were being treated not as curious outsiders granted temporary access, but as valued guests worthy of seeing the royal family's private world. In the Queen's sitting room, surrounded by personal photographs and comfortable furniture that made even Windsor Castle feel like a home, Camilla shared more details about why this recognition event had become so important to both her and the King. "His Majesty and I have been privileged to meet thousands of people throughout our public lives," she explained to the gathered group. "But the conversations we've had today, hearing about your work and your dedication to the people you serve, have been among the most inspiring we've experienced. You've reminded us what genuine public service looks like." As the afternoon drew to a close and guests began to prepare for their journey home, the impact of the day was evident in their transformed demeanor. People who had arrived nervous and uncertain were now confident and energized, feeling truly valued for perhaps the first time in their professional lives. Margaret Thompson, who had been among the first to arrive that morning, approached the King and Queen to express her gratitude before leaving. "Your Majesties," she said, her voice steady but emotional, "this has been the most extraordinary day of my life. But more than that, it's changed how I see my own work. I've always known it mattered to the people I care for, but now I understand that it matters to our entire society." King Charles smiled warmly and took her hands in his. "Margaret, your work has always mattered at this level. Today was simply about making sure you and your colleagues understand that truth. The care you provide preserves human dignity in circumstances that could easily strip it away. That's not just important work, it's sacred work." As the coaches departed Windsor Castle in the early evening, carrying 47 care professionals back to their regular lives, the impact of the day extended far beyond the individuals who had attended. News coverage of the event, featuring interviews with some of the honored guests, began to shift public conversation about the value of care work and the people who dedicate their lives to it. The King and Queen stood in the castle courtyard, watching the final coach disappear through the ancient gates. They had hosted hundreds of official functions throughout their lives, but this afternoon had felt different. By choosing to honor care professionals, they had made a statement about what their reign would value and celebrate. "Do you think it made the difference we hoped for?" Camilla asked her husband as they walked back into the castle. Charles nodded thoughtfully. "I think it was a beginning," he replied, "but the real impact will come from how those remarkable people feel about their work tomorrow morning, and how the rest of us think about the care we might need someday." The day at Windsor Castle had honoured 47 individuals, but its true significance lay in the recognition it brought to thousands of care professionals across the United Kingdom who perform similar acts of dedication every day. In choosing to celebrate these unsung heroes, King Charles and Queen Camilla had demonstrated that true nobility lay not in titles or wealth, but in service to others, especially those most in need of compassion and care.